One correction, there's no book on the subject. There might be one at some future date. Right now there are two articles, long articles, one on the Gorbachev reforms and Chinese reforms, and one comparing contemporary Russia with contemporary China. I might say, in supplement to what Clay said, I was trained in Soviet studies in the 1960s, the last century, not the previous one. I then went into China and did some comparative work, then worked mainly on domestic China, and now I'm sort of coming back to it and to see what can be learned by comparing these two that are now very different but still have some very important similarities. So what I want to do is to begin with an overview of the major themes, then to look briefly at the historical background in China, that is since '78, then look at Russian historical background from Gorbachev on, and then at authoritarian rule in Russia since 2000, followed by contemporary China, and then finally a short section on economic interests and political change. By that time, you may all be asleep, or I will have run over my quota of time, but I'll try anyway. So the overview begins simply by saying that China and Russia are both thought to be authoritarian rather than democratic regimes. In both, largely unaccountable power is concentrated at the top. Both subordinate the rule of law, and in both, corruption is ubiquitous. But their politics differ. Russia, in the current political science jargon, is called a hybrid regime. And this reflects a new sort of trend in the study of authoritarianism, according to which there are quite a number of regimes that have both democratic features and authoritarian ones, although the authoritarian ones generally predominate. China, on the other hand, is fully authoritarian. It does not have democratic elements, as I understand the term. So what the Russian Federation has is functioning democratic elements, but they're very restrictive. Still, they're there. Competitive parties, multi-party elections, and the print press is partially free. At the same time, you have manipulation and strong-arm tactics that essentially ensure victory for the dominant party, for the ruling party, which is called United Russia. Russia, in principle, accepts the Western norms of democracy. And I don't mean to shortchange those non-Western democracies that have accepted those norms. Look at Taiwan, look at Japan, look at India. So I'm using that as shorthand, if you will. And the president, President Medvedev, who assumed office in '08, says the multi-party system has become the most important tool for ensuring the rights and freedoms of our people, including their exclusive right to power. Now, a lot of Russians will simply laugh at this. But my point here is you can look at abuses of the democratic process, and you can measure them against this standard that Medvedev here sets forth. Chinese leaders, on the other hand, vehemently reject any kind of Western democracy. Leads to chaos, and it's simply not applicable to China in terms of Chinese values and what Chinese people want. At the same time, they do claim to be building a democratic system. But their version of democracy, as I understand it, is essentially consultative. And I illustrate this with an example. You know, China, in addition to the dominant Communist Party, has 8 small democratic parties. These are mostly holdovers from before 1949. And they're kind of sort of the, here's the CCP sun, and around it there are some satellite stars, satellite moons, if you will. Those democratic parties, this is now quoting from a major document that was published a few years ago, must accept Communist Party leadership with the CCP holding power and the 8 parties participating fully in state affairs. So this means that these parties can participate, they're consulted, they can have input, but they have no leverage. That is, it's the Communist Party that decides, yes, we're going to listen to you, and sometimes the advice may be very helpful, but it's a very different thing from saying that these are independent parties. So the current official discourse in China emphasizes what increasingly are recognized as Confucian authoritarian values: harmony, stability, benevolence, avoidance of conflict. And again, this distinguishes China from certainly the Western model of democracy, where you have conflict, where conflict is at the center, conflict between, say, competitive political parties. At the same time, China's authoritarianism has both soft and hard components. That is, these are simply differentiated by the degree of repression, by the degree of tolerance for dissent, and by similar markers that are on a continuum rather than one is totally one and the other is totally the other. Those kinds of hard and soft components can also be present in Russia, but unlike China, there is this crucial additional democratic element. Now, a final important difference between the Russian Federation and the PRC is, of course, that China is a highly successful developmental state, an authoritarian developmental state. And indeed, it's difficult to understand China's enormous success without invoking the fact that this is not a democracy, but an authoritarian regime. Russia, on the other hand, is something of a petrostate, having relied heavily on oil and gas revenues. And it's only a couple of years ago that, again, the president, the current president, issues a call for concerted modernization. And the open issue is then, will the Russian Federation take an authoritarian or a democratic, or rather a more democratic route? It's an open question, whereas in China, I think as far as I can predict or understand, the future is pretty much closed, assuming China's leaders get their way. Now, briefly going over some necessary political background. You know that since 1978, development has been the country's central priority, its central task. Everything is focused on development. Now, in order to have development and to distinguish as compared to the situation under Chairman Mao, where there also was development, but it wasn't very useful, development in the view of the new leaders of China required the liberation of what Marxists call the productive forces. That is to say, the means of production and also those who work them. That would be relations of production, I suppose. But they should be liberated from administrative constraint. In other words, the country should switch from hard to soft power. The most visible example, of course, is decollectivization of agriculture, where you have the communes imposing tight constraints on what peasants could do. Now they're gone, and while the constraints have not by any means disappeared, the key fact is that they were lifted to the extent that you could then have a very substantial breakthrough in output and productivity. So, broadly speaking, lifting constraints on society, the adoption of markets then was a key factor in China's rapid economic growth. Now, development in view of the people who were debating policy in the 1980s also required a certain amount of political loosening, or soft power, if you will. That is, a freer, not free, media, freer but not free policy debates. And in the 1980s, and this was simply because if you're going to have to consult experts, if you're going to have broader debates about the way the country is going and what it is that should be reformed and how it should be reformed, you needed, as I say, a more permissive environment in which these things can be discussed. Now, conservatives in China feared that the loosening would lead to pressures for what is called political liberalization. That is to say, from freer media to fully free media, from mobilizational interest groups that work on the initiative of the state to autonomous interest group, and in the end, to Western-style democracy. So the slogan, "We must oppose all-out Westernization," came up in the middle 1980s as a way to symbolize what these conservatives certainly did not want. Now, the reformers, on the other hand, argued that without political loosening, economic reforms would be stifled. They would be stifled by the existing bureaucracies that would then retain their overwhelming power over society. So Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader, was strongly in favor of market reforms. He said, without market reforms, China has a dim future. But he also agreed with the conservatives about the danger of political liberalization. So you have some campaigns in the early mid-80s against political liberalization, but they have the consequence that they easily spill over into the economic realm. That is, if you oppose political liberalization, what about private entrepreneurs who are presumably exploiting labor, or who are getting unduly rich, making super profits? So there were attacks on them, and Deng, then alerted by people like then Premier Zhao Ziyang, told Deng about it, who then put an end to those campaigns. It's a complex story which I'm only simplifying or telling in a very simple way. These conflicts then culminated in the 1989 democracy movement, which drew in the masses because of students and ordinary people, because of anger against corruption and inflation, and it engulfs not just Beijing, but probably up to around 200 cities or so. This was a major, major upheaval, the greatest single challenge to the regime that has arisen since 1978. Now, students wanted autonomous student union. This again was the critical dividing line, autonomy. And some workers demanded free trade unions rather than the state-organized trade unions. Well, all this agitation culminated in the crackdown on June 4th, or night of June 3rd, 4th. And the regime drew the lesson from this: we must not allow any opening to political liberalization. And some leaders who were deemed to be sympathetic to this cause then were purged. Zhao Ziyang, then the first party secretary, spent the rest of his life under house arrest, but he wrote some very fascinating memoirs that shed light on that period. Now, the determination of the leaders to hold the line was strongly reinforced by the enormous shock of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and in '89, and in the Soviet Union in 1991. And the regime, which has spent years studying this, why it is that the Soviet Union fell, essentially concluded it was the product of Gorbachev's, the Soviet leader Gorbachev's liberalizing policies. He unleashed forces which he couldn't control and which ultimately led to the disintegration of the Communist Party and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So this reinforced their determination. Now, two historical points there. Conservatives managed to block further economic reform in the aftermath of Tiananmen. Deng Xiaoping then succeeded in reviving it, but this revival was based on a regime consensus that Deng shared against political liberalization, and so economic reforms are essentially decoupled from political change. Now, turning to the Soviet Union and to the Russian Federation, Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in 1985, in about 3 years later initiated not just political liberalization, but really competitive elections and democratization. Now, and his efforts, praiseworthy as they were, undoubtedly from most people's standpoint, nonetheless led to the what to the Chinese was an enormous disaster. His successor, president of the Russian Federation after the periphery of the Soviet Union, the peripheral states all split off, he was president of the Russian Federation 1991 to 1999, and he presided over something of a democracy. But by all accounts, it was a kind of ramshackle political system. For one, there was one armed conflict with the parliament, and this was followed then by rewriting of the Constitution to tilt it in favor of the presidency, allowing him to rule by decree, at least for a certain extent. Then you had the manipulation of the two elections that were held, 1993, 1996, and Yeltsin then presided over a chaotic, crisis-ridden state where there was a lot of disorder, a lot of crime, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of dislocation. So corrupt privatization led to the concentration of immense wealth in a group of people called oligarchs. Then you have shock therapy price reform in 1992, which fueled inflation, wiped out people's savings, and about 40% of the population fell below the poverty line. This, of course, caused popular disillusionment with government, but still, according to the surveys done by the late 1990s, strong adherence to democratic values, but disillusionment with the government's failure to live up to them. At the same time, given the situation of the 1990s, there was longing for a strong leader, for order, and for stability. Now, Vladimir Putin was elected president in 2000 and again in 2004. In 2008, he obeyed the constitutional two-term limit, but he secures his protege Medvedev's election as president, and then he turns around and appoints Putin as his prime minister, and so you have a duumvirate, really, two guys ruling the country in tandem, which is a very interesting sort of situation. And people today speculate about next year's elections, about who will run, who will win. Anyway, Putin was a former KGB agent officer, and he strongly identified with the Russian tradition of a strong state, the restoration of law and order, and in general, a tough, effective kind of government. He did not establish a fully authoritarian regime. He just moved in that direction. He retained the democratic elements, and I think it was for reasons of international legitimacy and domestic legitimacy. That is, if you look at those surveys of public opinion, I think he would have found it more difficult to establish himself well if he had gone all the way to authoritarianism. So he advocated what is called managed democracy. And many states are like that. There are quite a few that practice this. Anyway, he re-centralized power in the presidential administration, and then he relied heavily on the so-called siloviki, that is to say, men of strength, muscle men, basically, who mostly came from the security services and on whom he could rely to intimidate opponents and to get his way. So the regime, and that continues to this, more or less to this day, is very distrustful of spontaneous, independent political activity, particularly, for example, demonstrations, which are legal according to the Constitution, but the constitutional freedom is not properly enforced. This distrust was greatly enforced by these color revolutions that some of you may recall from 2003, 2005 in places like the Ukraine, where more or less semi-authoritarian regimes were overthrown in the name of democracy, essentially through people's power and through what the Putin regime felt was Western manipulation. Chinese, incidentally, felt exactly the same way. Then you have this ongoing problem of North Caucasus terrorism originating in Chechnya, and that reinforces the control orientation of the two, of Putin and his successor. So you have intimidation, silencing of opponents, an executive-dominated legal system, and you see, list one example there, the case of this of Mr. Khodorkovsky, who was jailed in 2003 because he was an oligarch, immensely rich, and he threatened to enter politics and therefore threatened Putin's position. So he was jailed for a number of years, his company broken up, and last month he was re-jailed and sentenced for another 5 years. So now we come to several points here where we can look at aspects that do have real democratic features, and I have 3 of those. One is the media, the other are political parties, and the final one is elections. Now, on the one hand, you have the authoritarian part of it, that is, Putin appropriated national TV, which is the main channel to reach the public, and it preaches a pro-Putin line full of admiration for the great man, and it excludes oppositions. Some newspapers then were bought up by state corporations, and there was what some Russians call telephone censorship, telling editors not to cover certain events or not to print certain things. Then there was also a law which Putin had adopted against what's called extremism and protection of citizens' honor, dignity, reputations, which then was invoked against journalists who allegedly violated this law, e.g. by exposing corruption or something of that nature. Worst of all, you have a series of murders of journalists and really savage beatings of journalists. Culprits aren't found. Putin's role in this, of course, is not at all known. I mean, a lot of this was probably done by business-connected mafias or by local power holders whom courageous journalists had criticized in various ways and who retaliated in this way. Of course, you have something like that in China too. Still, you do have a number of independent print papers in Russia, and they do criticize the government, often vehemently so. and that includes the top leaders. A taboo in China. In China, you cannot criticize the top leadership. It's simply a no-no in terms of the country's censorship. So they expose corruption, often at their peril, police crimes, that is the very abusive police system, miscarriages of justice. One particular end-of-year article that I read chastised the regime for failure to deal with Russia's real problems and for putting people to sleep. Now, political parties, again, you begin with the authoritarian aspect of it. Putin thought there were too many parties, and so a number of requirements for registration and of a party and allowing it to run were imposed that were difficult to meet. Also, the direct election of regional governors was ended. The threshold for representation in the Duma was raised. So again, small parties found it difficult to compete. So now today there are 4 parties. One is the dominant one, United Russia. Then there's the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which came very close, well, it didn't come all that close, but came fairly close in 1996 to in the election between the communist leader and Yeltsin. And then something called the Liberal Democratic Party and one called Just Russia, the kind of middle-of-the-road parties. In elections, the majorities for the top leaders are not as impressive as they would be, say, in a communist country, fully, where you have 99% people voting for the parliament, or if there's a presidential election for the president. So it isn't complete. The United Russia got 2/3 of the Duma seats in 2007, so they have pretty much full control. It also gets state resources. State company employees may be told if you don't vote for UR, you lose your job. Opposition candidates may be disqualified, even jailed, campaign literature confiscated. Courts don't do much for you. But there is some choice. A year ago, there were local elections, and United Russia was trounced with a quarter of the votes cast. This is in the city of Irkutsk in Siberia. Maybe it was too cold to go out to vote, I don't know. But the Communist Party won with 63%. So this was an endorsement of an opposition party. And the United Russia also suffered losses in 4 of 8 regions. And the problems were unemployment and various deleterious economic conditions. So people were able, to some degree at least, to vote their pocketbooks. Now, since Medvedev, who came to power in 2008 and who's in general adopted a more moderate pro-democratic line, made a speech in which he said, well, the turnover of parties in power is a normal development. He also admitted that conditions for free, fair, and civilized competition needed to be improved. In other words, some of these abuses I've just listed clearly come under that rubric. So the question is, did he mean it? He's a somewhat ambiguous individual, and it's not quite clear whether he's trying to retain Putin's support and therefore has to pull his punches, or whether he's more of a demagogue. I don't know. So then he also, in the same speech, he says any attempts to use democratic slogans to destabilize the situation, the government, or split society will be prevented. Now, that smacks to me of crackdown. So the question then is change in the offing in the Russian Republic, in the Russian Federation? Putin in recent months had said, well, we're going to allow the opposition to have its say on the on television. although he then accompanied it by saying, well, they tell lies, and we'll tolerate it, we can swallow that. Medvedev also chimed in again, we need political competition. Then there will be some concessions to parties in the Duma who didn't get into the Duma because of these high thresholds. And so now we have this oncoming two elections. In late fall of 11, there will be elections to the Duma, and next spring there will be presidential elections. And so there is this endless discussion and speculation of the relations between Medvedev and Putin. Imagine press speculation in China about the relations between Premier Wen Jiabao and Party General Secretary Hu Jintao. Unimaginable. So UR, that is United Russia, is not likely to be defeated, but still a larger role for opposition parties is likely, so somewhat optimistic about some change, not too much change. China's development, rapid, highly successful development, also produced, of course, major consequences for society. From the 1990s on, it produced winners and losers. The rise of new groups. There was horizontal upward and downward mobility, and very high levels of inequality developed. That in turn led to societal pluralization. New interests emerge that are clearly visible, yet are not allowed to have an organized voice. New demands, and implicit in them, I think, is a demand for a real voice, for meaningful participation. So I'm discussing the three groups here. One is dissidents, that is the smallest, and for reasons of time, I won't discuss them, except they're, of course, subject to repression, with the interesting exception that some prestigious party veterans are simply left alone when they write letters to the leader asking for end of censorship and indeed for democracy. Then the country has many, many NGOs. Some people estimate them at 350,000. My impression is that most really want to cooperate with the government to improve the country's situation, especially the environment. And the earthquake in Sichuan 2 years ago showed this outpouring of popular interest and even organization to try to help the victims of the earthquake. So there is an underlying readiness in society, I think, to participate more. Now, the regime, with regard to NGOs, accepts them, but very cautiously. It's very much afraid that there could be unforeseen consequences, the proliferation of de facto autonomous groups. So they impose all kinds of stiff registration and financial requirements. You can't organize a nationwide NGO that has branches in different administrative jurisdictions. There's great suspicion of foreign funding, as in Russia also. But there are some groups that do succeed, and I just list an example here, Andrew Mercer's short book called Water Warriors, in which he traces the process by which a major success was attained in preventing a dam from being constructed. Others are gongos, that is government-organized NGOs. And then you have protest groups, that is large groups whose grievances were essentially induced by state policies, varying sorts. There's SOE, state industry unemployment, forced relocation of urbanites, abusive rural taxation, corrupt land requisitioning, which is currently the major rural problem, and abusive local officials. So you have protests that are ongoing. There are about 100,000 a year. They slowly increase, but the number of participants is relatively small. I think about 15 million or so. You divide that by 100,000, you don't get terribly many people. They're limited, that is, they're riots, strikes, demonstrations, what the Chinese government calls mass incidents. They're localized, they're not coordinated, they lack sustained leadership, and they're not against the regime. That's perhaps the most important thing. What they put their faith in is that there is a benevolent center which tries to help them. And this has been going on for a long time. Now, the response to protests is often to arrest the ringleaders, not to allow protests to spill across administrative boundaries, or to allow different class groups from joining up, say intellectuals and workers, which would be a combination that they well understand from their own revolutionary history. There is some tolerance for what scholars call rightful resistance, that is, groups taking advantage of what the law says, and they want the regime simply to observe the law. There are also a large set of remedial policies, welfare reform, the abolition of rural taxes, the law and regulatory laws on land requisitions. Some of these have been successful, many others have not, and the protests continue. Now, one final word on Chinese society is this contested terrain of the internet, which is an absolutely fascinating cat and mouse game that is going on there. China has an estimated 420 million internet users. Russia has far fewer, and the Russian internet is essentially free. But because the regime fears that the internet could lead to the mobilization of groups that would then take to the streets, it fears this potential. In fact, it greatly fears it. And so there's an immense effort, very costly effort, to monitor websites, blogs, bulletin boards, chat rooms, impose registration requirements. And there is a stream of directives that are issued, which Chinese netizens call from the Ministry of Truth. Remember George Orwell's novel, 1984. And which simply say, you cannot write on this. Recently there was one, you cannot write about Egypt except what the official news agency reports. So you can't write about this outpouring of people who demand democracy. But then there's also relative tolerance for exposure of local abuses, killings by officials of ordinary people, corruption, of course, and monitors shut down websites and punish major violators, but netizens are skilled at evasion. So I say there is a fascinating cat and mouse game going on, circumvention, humor, satire, the little grass horse, and other things like that that provide homonyms. If you want to write about June 4th, you don't mention June 4th because that will get immediately deleted. But if you say May 35th, you know, it might get by the censors until they wise up to it and then close it down. Print media, which I don't have time to discuss, they're also censored. Editors have been jailed, papers closed down. Academic journals, I think, are a lot freer, provided they don't transgress. Anyway, there is a large gray zone in which critics maneuver. So the regime continues to want to hold the line. It recognizes, on the one hand, that people have a right to know, they have a right to sue officials for misconduct, they have a right to be involved in state affairs and to participate in various consultative activity. But in recent years, and this is really quite a disturbing tendency, there's been a tendency towards hard approaches. You know, Chinese have these slogans called harmonious society, and stability above all, which implicitly empower local officials to crack down on protesters or on anybody that they feel is getting out of hand. the web people talk about a website having been harmonized, that is to say, deleted, shut down. That's a sign that harmony is being established. So there's a prominent sociologist, particularly a man named Yu Jianrong, who's a specialist on peasants, and he wrote an article criticizing what he says we are practicing, which is rigid stability. That is essentially taking this idea of stability to its extreme, and he calls for rule of law and resilient stability. And the rulers themselves seem uncertain at times on how to deal with an increasingly complex and volatile society. Hu Jintao said at the 17th Congress, it has become more difficult to accommodate the interests of all sides. You know, the party claims to represent all interests in society, which of course imposes obligations which it really can't meet. Then last August, Premier Wen Jiabao affirmed liberal values, free press, and a variety of other things in the special economic zone that adjoins Hong Kong, and also in a CNN interview. His own press censored him. So Beijing wasn't carried in the official press. So one wonders, is this a sign of discord? But as of now, I would simply say I see no signs that liberalizing policies are about to come. But then, as in Russia, let's wait until the next great meeting, which is the 18th Party Congress next year. So I'd like to then conclude with this discussion here about economic interests and political change. In China, of course, we all know that rapid development gave rise to an entrepreneurial and middle class. It also resulted in the entrenchment of a powerful party apparatus, especially local party secretaries that are closely tied to business interests. You know, because performance in China of party secretaries is very much tied to economic growth, they have an interest in fostering the kinds of business that produce this and to override whatever local objections there might be, including, say, environmental considerations. In both cases, they are barriers to liberalizing change. In other words, they're very large interest groups that, in my view, are not very interested in democracy. The middle class is dependent on the state, and it's afraid, I think, probably afraid of the masses in China, the people who are most disadvantaged by the reforms, by the changes that have taken place. Party apparatus, of course, also doesn't. So Barrington Moore says, no bourgeoisie, no democracy. Here we have a bourgeoisie and still no democracy, as so many people predicted would happen. You know, China gives rise to a middle class, and of course it will lead to to democracy. Looking at the Russian Federation, you have a similar sort of strong interweaving of business and government elites at the local and national levels. And similarly, these elites, as far as I understand them, are not likely to view expansion of democracy as in their interests. But in sharp contrast to China, this political economic elite has not done much to develop the country. It's more a product of the redistribution of Soviet-era assets and the exploitation and export of natural resources. Now, in 2009, Medvedev, who does say a lot of very interesting things, he called for a concerted national effort to modernize. And he severely criticized the country's failure to move beyond the Soviet era and to replace aging infrastructure of industrial plant and to build a new system. And among his remarks was this: we have not freed ourselves from a primitive economic structure and humiliating dependence on raw materials. And he said it was the Soviets that built the industrial system. We didn't build it, and so we have to do something new. There is now a debate going on how to bring this about. And a year ago, there was quite a spirited debate about the Chinese model. Should Russia attempt to emulate the Soviet model? Here, tables turn. In the 1950s, of course, China emulated the Soviet model. Now the question is, will Russia emulate the Soviet model? And of course, that is an authoritarian approach. But others say, no, we should really try to draw in the public, we should expand participation, and we should take a democratic route. Medvedev has expressed that he favors the latter. Whether that will be the case or not, I don't know. So what this points to here then is that Russia's hybrid authoritarianism makes possible the discussion of alternative routes to development. Political choices before Russia are therefore more open than they are in China. And again, we need to watch the elections that are coming to see whether Russia will stay on the same track or go forward in a more democratic direction. My prudent conclusion for China is that it might move towards more soft authoritarianism, relax its rule, perhaps try to be more skillful in the way it manipulates, or in the way it tries to maintain stability and harmony in things. But I don't see signs of movement towards liberalization and democracy. But again, here, you have to watch for new leaders that the new generation of leaders that will take over at the 18th Party Congress next year. Whether they'll be different is a big question. My initial sort of guess about them, they will not. They've been brought up in the same sort of milieu, and they probably share the predominant values that the current leadership does. But then we might be in for a surprise. Gorbachev came out of the Soviet milieu. He spent his entire life as a party secretary in agriculture and then at the top, and yet he changed. He became a Western-style Democrat. He liberalized the system. He democratized the system. Where did that come from? So people do change, and one can only hope that maybe the Chinese will. Thank you very much.